The cemetery was still, the kind of silence that presses against the skin like a weight, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the slow toll of a bell carried by the wind. And beneath the arching oaks of Arlington, mourners dressed in black lined the rows of white headstones, their eyes red, their bodies heavy with grief. At the center of it all stood General Alicia Monroe, her uniform gleaming white against a dark sea of sorrow, her hand steady as she folded the American flag with precision. Every crease a symbol of respect for the soldier they were laying to rest, and though her face was calm, her presence carried a gravity that drew every eye. She was not only a high-ranking officer, but a living reminder of the discipline, sacrifice, and honor that these funerals embodied. Yet just as she lowered the flag into the trembling hands of the widow before her, a sudden crack in the air shattered the sacred stillness. A voice, harsh and furious, cutting through the ceremony like a blade, and all heads turned to see Officer Daniel Briggs striding forward, his uniform not of the military but of the police, his face twisted with rage, his accusations spilling into the air. "She doesn't belong here. That's no general. This is a disgrace." And before the shock could even settle, before anyone could process that this sacred burial had been defiled by such venom, Briggs yanked a pistol from his holster and leveled it straight at Alicia's chest, the crowd gasping in a single, collective breath. Mothers shielding children, soldiers shifting on instinct, yet frozen by the sheer audacity of the act. Alicia did not flinch, her eyes narrowing only slightly as she stood rooted to the earth, unyielding in the face of hatred and violence. The folded flag still cradled in her hands, and for a moment time itself seemed to stop. The gun, the general, the widow, the mourners, all caught in a tableau of disbelief as the sacred ritual of farewell teetered on the edge of desecration. And though no one yet knew it, this act of brazen hatred would not only cost Briggs his freedom, but would echo through the nation as the day dignity stood tall against the barrel of a gun. The moment Briggs's weapon leveled at Alicia's chest, the funeral's reverent hush dissolved into gasps, screams, and frantic shuffling. The widow clutching the folded flag tighter to her chest, as if it were a shield against the chaos. Children burying their faces into parents' coats. And yet through it all, General Alicia Monroe remained immovable, her chin lifted, her dark eyes locked not on the trembling barrel, but on the man holding it, her posture unyielding as though the centuries of sacrifice etched into Arlington's rose were bracing her spine. Briggs barked again, spit flying as he shouted, "You don't deserve that uniform. You think you can act like one of them while you stand here? Not while I'm alive." His words ringing with the bitter venom of prejudice dressed as authority, and each syllable desecrated the solemnity of the burial ground, turning sacred silence into a stage for hatred. Yet still Alicia did not move, one hand resting lightly against her chest while the other stayed at her side, signaling subtly to the soldiers around her, "Stand down," because she knew that any sudden motion could tip the scales into bloodshed, and so the honor guard, their hands hovering near their sidearms, froze in uneasy obedience, their eyes burning with the desire to act but held in check by her silent command. The crowd, meanwhile, erupted into whispers and accusations, some crying for someone to tackle the man, others fumbling phones to record, others paralyzed in disbelief that a military general, in full dress whites, could be humiliated in such a sacred place by a man sworn to protect. And as Briggs waved his gun, his voice grew harsher, louder, fueled by the shocked silence around him. "This country is being stolen. A real soldier doesn't look like you." The venom in his tone slicing deeper than the weapon he wielded, and the sting of his words carried across the mourners, some of whom began to weep not only for the man buried that day, but for the insult clawing its way into the ceremony meant to honor him. Still, Alicia's face did not break. Her lips pressed together, her gaze unwavering, her silence louder than his shouts, and though her heart thudded against her ribs, she knew that flinching, pleading, or breaking would only give him the power he craved. So she stood, a statue of composure beneath the trembling aim of his weapon, and the longer she remained calm, the more unhinged Briggs became, his voice cracking as if the strength he believed he were being siphoned away by her refusal to acknowledge his authority, his rage twisting into desperation until a line between threat and implosion blurred. The sacred funeral now teetering not just on grief but on the precipice of violence. Every eye locked on the surreal tableau of hate and dignity locked in a deadly standoff. Before the trigger could twitch, the sharp command of boots on gravel cut through the static of panic. Two military police emerging from the tree line with movements so precise they seemed choreographed by the silence itself. One angling to Briggs's blind side while the other advanced down his line of fire. Alicia's chin lifted a fraction, her gaze flicking once, permission, and like a camera shutter the world snapped back into motion. The nearer MP slid a hand to Briggs's wrist, the other clamped. The slide of the pistol, wrench pinched, rotated, and the weapon was out, skittering across the grass as a third MP. No one had even seen him until then. Caught under a boot and racked it clear with a crisp, metallic bark that sent sparrows leaping from the oaks. The widow's sob turned to a grateful gasp. The honor guard exhaled as one, and Briggs hit the earth with a thud that shook the flagstones, cursing, kicking, spitting out words that made parents cover children's ears. The senior MP said, "Hands where we can see them," but his tone was already beyond question because the cuffs were on, the weapon was tagged, and the immediate nightmare was over. The MPs exchanged glances, and one of them tapped his shoulder mic to say, "Control, confirm body cam status on subject Briggs," which was a true shock and the twist that froze the funeral once more. We got an ongoing capture from local PD as well as civilian feeds. The retort was an explosive affirmative. Since 9:02, the body cam has been rolling. Additionally, Control is pulling internal GPD alerts. Stand by. Before proceeding toward the perimeter where the MPs were securing the scene, Alicia, still unflinching, whispered with honor as she tucked the folded flag into the widow's arms. After thrashing once more, Briggs became eerily still and smiled thinly, as if he had fallen into a soft place. No, he wouldn't, because even as the mourners steadied, phones trembling in their hands, the first breadcrumb fell. A junior detective from the civilian task force, drawn to the cemetery by reports of disorderly armed officer, arrived breathless, tablet in hand, and said, "General MPs, Internal Affairs flagged a pattern the moment his badge number hit the net. Complaints. Lots. Most marked unsubstantiated or resolved by counseling, but they're ugly." He glanced at the widow and swallowed. "There's more." Briggs's own body cam, which was activated as he parked to the curb, had captured a monologue of bile, him practicing the words he would fling like darts, not a random outburst, but a premeditated disruption of a military funeral. The more detonated over the next hour, not with gunfire, but with data. He'd texted a private group chat moments before he stepped onto the grass. "Watch this. Gonna make a statement. Won't let them hand our flag to a fraud." The chat's name, pulled from his phone under exigent circumstances, was a collage of symbols and slurs that made the MP's faces harden. A supervisor tried to call him off mid-rant. Briggs declined the call and typed, "Too late. Cameras rolling. Gonna expose her." Dozens of civilian videos corroborated the sequence. Even the cemetery's quiet security cameras caught the approach, the draw, the aim, the trembling barrel. Every angle told the same story, unspinnable, undeniable. Then the file drop started. First, a mother who'd filed a complaint 3 years earlier, saying Briggs had shoved her teenage son against a cruiser for mouthing off, and then charged him with resisting when the boy cried. Her case had vanished into the long grass of insufficient evidence. Next, a clerk from a gas station, who said Briggs had demanded to see his immigration papers, though the clerk had been born 2 miles from the station. Then an officer, retired, emailed Internal Affairs from a burner account, and finally agreed to identify himself in person. He'd warned the precinct captain 2 summers ago that Daniel Briggs had become a gravity well for trouble, that his temper spiked around black drivers, black teens, black faces, period. The captain had advised brotherly coaching and reassigned Briggs to desk duty for 1 week. He'd been back on patrol by the next payday, angrier and more careful about where he pointed his rage. Careful until today. A prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's office stepped onto grass in a navy suit that looked wildly out of place among dressed whites in mourning black. She introduced herself, then spoke with clinical clarity that made the air feel thinner. Given that this occurred on federal property during an official military ceremony, we're coordinating with state authorities. She said, eyes steady on Briggs. We're looking at assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, obstruction of an official proceeding, civil rights violations under the guise of law, brandishing on limited federal grounds, and hate crime enhancements supported by statements from the time they were committed. Also, She nodded toward the MPs. Attempted murder charges are on the table. Body cam evidence of deliberate intent handcuffed in the grass. Briggs huffed a hard laugh. You can't put me away for life over a gun I didn't fire, he said, too loud, like a man who'd read just enough law to be dangerous to himself. The prosecutor did not turn around. Sir, you pointed a loaded firearm at a United States general during a military funeral and declared she didn't deserve to live in your country. Those are your words, time-stamped, she replied. A trigger pull is not the only measure of lethal intent. As if summoned by the word loaded, the MP with the tag pistol lifted a clear evidence bag. Magazine full. Chambered round recovered from the grass. One in the pipe, he said. The crowd's murmur turned to a cold, collective inhale. Then came the second twist, the one that widened the case from a single criminal act into a map of rot. An analyst from the state AG Civil Rights Division ran into the cemetery with a printout of internal emails. A redacted thread showed a familiar pattern. Briggs's name was a recurring headache, but there was no appetite to yank the badge. Supervisors would scrawl keep an eye, and PR risk instead of suspend or terminate. One reply from a deputy chief read, He's rough around the edges but loyal. Don't overreact to the social media noise. Rotate him off the hot zones for a month. Another reply, Optics matter. We'll reevaluate after the next incident. The subsequent incident had taken place alongside a flag-draped coffin under an oak canopy. Alicia maintained her composure throughout the torrent. She gave her statement once, standing where she had stood when the gun rose, the honor guard behind her like an unspoken chaplet. She referred to facts as coordinates, such as his approach, his words, the angle of the muzzle, the barrels trembling and the flag's weight in her hands. She didn't grant him the gift of her fear. She let the record show her restraint. She refused to turn the funeral into a press conference when reporters arrived at the cemetery gate. Today is for the fallen and the family, she said. Justice will have its day elsewhere. A gray-haired woman in the back row stepped forward, clutching a purse to her chest, and that was when a third, quietly devastating twist came to light. She was Briggs's estranged aunt, it turned out, and she had saved everything. Old texts, screenshots, a notebook where she copied down his late-night rants, his pride in roughing up mouthy kids, his obsession with purity in uniforms and ranks. I begged him to get help, she told the investigators, voice shaking. He told me power was help. Her evidence, combined with the department's neglected complaints and Briggs's own digital exhaust, stitched a pattern no one could ignore without being complicit. Within 48 hours, warrants multiplied. Detective sees a home computer loaded with extremist forum posts and a hidden folder where Briggs had archived outtakes from his body cam, clips he'd saved because they thrilled him. The funeral video, which had begun as a local outrage, metastasized into a national reckoning. Not just a man pointing a gun at General, but a system that had left that man armed, uniformed, and confident enough to march into grief and aim at honor. Back at the cemetery, the MPs cleared the last evidence flags from the grass. The bugler, who had dropped his instrument in the panic, found it, brushed off the dew, and looked to Alicia. She nodded. The volley shattered the sky in 3 straight bursts as the rifle team reset, reclaiming the sound of gunfire as one of sacred duty rather than terror. As the final note of taps wavered and vanished, Alicia returned to the widow with the steadiness of a tide, and the mourners felt the axis of the day tilt back toward what it had been meant to be, a farewell unmarred by the cowardice of hate. Behind the oaks, a convoy door slammed. Briggs, sallow now, was guided into the back seat, head bent not in contrition but in the dawning comprehension that his audience of enablers had shrunk to zero. The twist had completed its turn. What began as one-man spectacle had become his undoing, and the very cameras he'd summoned as a stage were now the unblinking witnesses against him. Weeks later, the echoes of that gun pointed at a general carried into a wood-panel courtroom. The pews packed with reporters, veterans, activists, and citizens who had seen the footage 100 times on their phones, but now came to watch justice unfold in real time. And at the center sat Daniel Briggs in an ill-fitting suit, his wrists cuffed, his face drained of the cocky arrogance he had worn at the cemetery. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece. The body cam that caught his premeditated words, the group chats filled with racist bile, the civilian footage that showed the widow scream as he leveled his pistol at Alicia Monroe's chest, The decades of ignored complaints stacked like bricks in a wall that had finally collapsed. And with each exhibit, the jurors' expressions grew grimmer, their pens scratching like chisels carving his sentence into stone. Alicia herself testified, not with theatrics, but with the same composure she had worn at the funeral. Her voice steady as she recounted how she chose to stand still, not out of fear, but out of duty to mourners who deserved dignity. And when asked how it felt to be targeted in uniform by a man sworn to uphold the law, she answered simply, "It was not about me alone. It was about every soldier who ever wore this uniform and every citizen who believes that our ceremonies will always be held in the highest regard. He didn't just shoot me with a gun. He pointed it at what we stand for." Her words hushed the courtroom into a reverence that even the judge paused to honor, and when the defense tried to frame Briggs as unstable or momentarily overwhelmed, the mountain of evidence buried those excuses. The text bragged about making a statement, the ammunition loaded and chambered, the smile he flashed as if daring someone to stop him, proof enough that this was no lapse, but intent. The jury's deliberation was short, their verdict unanimous. Guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, and hate crimes. When the judge rose to deliver sentencing, her gavel struck like a rifle report as she declared that Daniel Briggs would spend the rest of his natural life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the unforgivable desecration of a sacred ceremony and the endangerment of a grieving family as aggravating, factors that demanded the maximum, and the room erupted, not in chaos but in tears of relief. Applause held until the judge allowed it, a wave of catharsis washing over people who had doubted that justice could be so absolute. Outside, Alicia left the courthouse in her dress uniform, her cap tucked under her arm, her posture as steady as it had been that day under the barrel of his gun. And though cameras swarmed, she offered no grand speeches, only a quiet statement. Justice is not revenge. Justice is a promise that dignity will not bow to hate. And then she walked away into the crowd, blending back into the people she served. The widow of the fallen soldier later said that while the funeral had been marred by hatred, the sentencing had given her peace, because a man who tried to dishonor their grief would never walk free again. And across the nation, the story spread not just as a downfall of a racist officer, but as a triumph of composure over chaos, dignity over violence, and a reminder etched in every headline that sometimes the strongest defiance is not in returning fire, but in standing unshaken until justice itself pulls the trigger on hate.